I'm a 21-year-old girl, and my story is about a stalker who kept coming to my workplace late at night. I worked part-time at a clothing store, which I won't name. I had been working there for almost a month and was still getting the hang of things. My shift was from 7 p.m. to 12 a.m., which meant I would close the store. Fortunately, the store policy was to always have 2 or more people closing, so we wouldn't be alone, especially since it was just us girls working there. The only man was my manager, who was rarely in. On my shift were my closest friend Shannon, a new girl named Katie, and the assistant manager Hannah. Shannon was vacuuming in the clothing department, Hannah was in the back dealing with shipments, and Katie was cleaning out the dressing rooms and putting away clothes. I was stationed at the front, where the cash registers are, and unfortunately I was alone. I didn't mind being up there by myself. I liked the peace and quiet since we didn't have many customers late at night. I'm very anxious and usually try not to make eye contact with people, often giving an awkward smile. Hannah brought up some new clothes that needed tagging and then returned to the back. I began tagging when a man walked in. He wore a light gray t-shirt, dark jeans, flip-flops, and a baseball cap. I greeted him with the usual welcome to the store and went back to tagging. The man took this as an invitation to come and talk to me. He leaned on the glass showcases at the counter. I asked if I could help him, and he requested to know where the men's beanies were, which we didn't sell. I informed him, and he nodded, then fell silent, staring at me as I tagged clothes. I got uncomfortable but kept tagging, hoping he would go away. Minutes passed before he suddenly said my name. Hearing my name from his mouth creeped me out. I looked over nervously and asked if I could help him. By this time, he had been in the store for nearly an hour. He asked how hard my job was and how many days off I got. I told him it wasn't too hard, and I didn't get many days off due to a lack of workers. He asked if I wanted to leave work and do a little something together that creeped me out to the point I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I told him I had a boyfriend, which was true. He then got enraged, yelling, "Really? That's how you're gonna be?" The other girls heard the commotion and came up front. The man stormed out, but not before showing me a knife in his pocket. I started hyperventilating and crying. Shannon grabbed my hands, concerned, while Hannah asked what happened. I couldn't get my words out, just cried harder. Shannon took me to the back and held me. Hannah told me I could leave early. It was 11:30 p.m. I thanked her, grabbed my purse from my locker, and said my goodbyes. Cautiously, I walked to my car, only to see the same man sitting on the hood, twirling the blade. My knees turned to noodles, and I ran back inside, screaming for Hannah to lock the doors. She questioned why, and I pointed to my car. She saw him, cursed under her breath, locked the doors, set the alarms, and called the police. When the police arrived, they found only stab marks on my car and a cut brake line. I don't work at that store anymore. For the past 6 years, I've been self-employed, mowing lawns, doing landscaping, pulling up roots and stumps, and things like that. For the first few years, I would go door to door, knocking or leaving my business card, hoping people wanted some lawn service. If they already had someone, maybe I could offer a better rate. I can tell you now just how competitive that sort of business is, especially in the South. You see, down here, a lot of folks take pride in lawn care and farm care. When they get a tree that needs cutting down, they like to do it themselves. When they've got acres of land in need of some brush hogging, they do it themselves too, more often than not. So for the first few years, my jobs were few and far between. Revenue was low, and contracts were slow to come in. I cut prices as much as I could. I'd go door to door every day, hoping that I wasn't just bothering people. This story in particular is one I've wanted to tell for a while, but as I'm someone who doesn't really have people in my life, like friends or close family members, I didn't really have anyone to talk to. So it's nice to have some place to share. This is actually the story of what got my business off the ground. I finally found a farmer who did not want to mow and clear his own land. He had purchased a few acres away from his own farmland, so there was a gap of forest between his new land and his current land. He wasn't too happy about this because the bid he'd placed for the land in between was being delayed. I don't know what that means or how bids get delayed or how that works, but that sucks for him. But because I lived closer to the plot of land that he wanted to clear out, and because he was already busy with his crops on his current land, he decided to contract me to mow and clear the land there. That would entail brush hogging several acres, cutting down some trees, and uprooting a bunch of stumps, all of which I know how to do and do quite well. The week came when I would be fulfilling this contract. My plan was to get it all done within 5 days. Immediately upon arriving there, I noticed something weird. A good 50 yards or so of the land had been cleared already. It looked like someone started to clear it and just changed their mind. If I had to guess, it looked like the farmer did it. Maybe he stopped when he realized he didn't have time to do it himself. I just went with that and started my work. As I had 2 or 3 other clients during the day, I usually ended up out here around 6 p.m., just before it got really dark. I would work well into the morning too, usually leaving around 4 a.m. I worked myself to the bone so that I'd not only get the contract done in time, but I'd also have a spare day to make sure everything looked great. If you're thinking that doing all this at night is a bad idea, it was well away from any other people living out there, and I'm talking miles. They wouldn't even hear me in the distance. Plus, I had a couple of spotlights that I could set up before I started working. The first night was the roughest. I had tall grass next to me alongside as I ran. I could tell just how much faster it was than me, and I couldn't help but wonder why it never lapped out and dragged me away. It could if it wanted to, but I made it to my truck. I flung open the door, slammed it shut, turned the key in the ignition, and drove home. There I sat in the dark interior of my truck, my ankle severely bruised, even further behind on my contract that I had to finish, or I wouldn't be able to pay my bills. A grown man nearly in tears. What was wrong with me? I brainstormed the entire drive home, praying that there weren't any cops at the regular speed traps because I wasn't driving right at all, not in that panicked state. But my racing mind finally led me to an idea: my brother. My brother lived a couple of towns over, about an hour away, so it wasn't too close, but I was desperate more than ever. I gave him a call that night. I apologized because he had been sleeping. Then I asked him if he'd join me on a job. I offered him half of the pay of the contract to help me finish it out, but I never told him the other half of his duty to just be there and make me feel safe. You see, my brother had a sidearm and a concealed carry permit, so I would certainly feel safer with him being there. With double the manpower, I was able to finish up the grass the next day and clear out nearly all the stumps. I had to sacrifice half my pay, but I really did appreciate my brother coming by. Now, toward the end of that day, we had the choice of staying overtime to just finish it up and call it quits for good, or coming back the next day for a half day. In my head, doing a half day the next day meant a little bit more daytime to finish up, but then again, the idea of just getting it done that night felt better. So that's what we decided to do. We worked until about 5 a.m., and the worst that happened then was my brother coming to me when I had my headphones in and asking me what those weird sounds were. And yeah, it was the same sounds, the shrill cries that were rat-like. and now I know they weren't from a rat. I told him it was just a bird. He went back to work, not really interested in knowing what kind of bird it was. When we were finally done, we went over to Waffle House and celebrated. But my stomach was queasy. The idea that I'd put my brother in danger too, just because I wanted to feel better, made me feel a bit guilty. Maybe I'll share this story with him soon. I hope he takes it well. And I hope that farmer's out there and he's doing okay. Last I heard from him, that hole that I'd packed got dug into and is open for business once again. I was in Littleton, Colorado, in the spring of 2017. I worked at the Melting Pot restaurant, which currently occupies an old 3-story building built in the early 1900s as a Carnegie library. There have been many documented cases of paranormal behavior at this location, and the restaurant was even featured on a ghost hunting TV show. The most haunted area is located in the basement, in a little L-shaped cove that has 5 booth tables for dining. The cove was down 2 little stairs, and immediately upon entering, you had a 4-top table on your left and a 2-person table on your right. Past the 4-top in the corner was a large round booth, and around the bend were 2 more 4-top tables and a dead end. The last table in the cove was considered the most haunted table in the restaurant. Many times people would bring spirit contacting boards and different conjuring type things to try and evoke a spirit sitting at the last table to do just that. One day, a co-worker and I were cleaning these tables late one night. He suddenly said, "Ow." Did she just scratch me? I hadn't touched him, and I told him that. He lifted up his shirt, and there were 3 large bleeding scratches going all the way down his back. He immediately freaked out, and soon after he quit, feeling as if this entity was trying to follow him home. A year later, I hadn't seen anything else unusual. One night around midnight, I started antagonizing the spirit in this area. Even after seeing that kid get scratched, I still wasn't convinced. So I was down there yelling out for something, saying something like, "You don't exist. If you did, you would show yourself." I figured there wouldn't be an answer, so I went back to bussing my last tables for the night. I was carrying a bus tub down the back stairs and had to walk by this cove to get to the kitchen. I've been a server for years and never dropped anything, let alone drop something out of a bus tub. Well, I walked by the cove and a metal fondue pot went flying out of my bus tub, down the 2 stairs, and into the haunted cove. I continued to the kitchen to place down my bus tub. Then I grabbed a towel to clean up the chocolate mess I'd made. At that point, I had forgotten about the antagonizing I had done an hour earlier. So I charged into the L-shaped cove to clean up the chocolate fondue pot that had somehow just leapt out of my bus tub and down the stairs. As soon as I entered, something grabbed me by my right shirt sleeve, throwing me into the rock wall, immediately smashing my head into it. It left me with a goose egg bump and a large cut on my forehead. I was so startled and I was bleeding everywhere. I had to run to the bathroom to clean up. I was in Littleton, Colorado, in the spring of 2017. I worked at the Melting Pot restaurant, which occupies an old 3-story building that was built in the early 1900s as a Carnegie library. There have been many documented cases of paranormal behavior at this location, and the restaurant was even featured on a ghost hunting TV show. The most haunted area is located in the basement in a little L-shaped cove that has 5 booth tables for dining. The cove is down 2 small stairs, and immediately upon entering, there is a 4-top table on the left and a 2-person table on the right. Past the 4-top in the corner is a large round booth, and around the bend are 2 more 4-top tables and a dead end. The last table in the cove is considered the most haunted table in the restaurant. Many times, people would bring spirit contacting boards and different conjuring type things to try and evoke a spirit. One day, a coworker and I were cleaning these tables late one night. He suddenly goes, "Oh dang, did she just scratch me? I hadn't touched him." And I told him that. He lifts up his shirt, and there are 3 large bleeding scratches going all the way down his back. He immediately freaks out and soon after quit, feeling as if this entity was trying to follow him home. A year later, I hadn't seen anything else unusual. One night around midnight, I started antagonizing the spirit in this area. Even after seeing that kid get scratched, I still wasn't convinced. So, I was down there yelling out for something, saying something like, "You don't exist. If you did, you would show yourself." I figured there wouldn't be an answer, so I went back to bussing my last tables for the night. I was carrying a bus tub down the back stairs and had to walk by this cove to get to the kitchen. I've been a server for years and never drop anything, let alone drop something out of a bus tub. Well, as I go walking by the cove, a metal fondue pot goes flying out of my bus tub, down the 2 stairs, and into the haunted cove. I continue to the kitchen to place down my bus tub. I then grabbed a towel to clean up the chocolate mess I'd made. At that point, I'd forgotten about the antagonizing I'd done an hour earlier, so I went charging into the L-shaped cove to clean up the chocolate fondue pot that had somehow just leapt out of my bus tub and down the stairs. As soon as I entered, something grabbed me by my right shirt sleeve and threw me into the rock wall, immediately smashing my head into it. It left me with a goose egg bump and a large cut on my forehead. I was so startled, and I was bleeding everywhere. At that point, I had to run to the bathroom to clean up. I'm a security officer for a company in Southern California. We work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities we service. As a patrol officer, my job is essentially the same as a police officer, unlike your typical observe and report security guards. We respond to calls ranging from simple trespassing to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and even shots fired, hence the officer in the title. I've been in several foot and vehicle pursuits, which is why we work closely with the local sheriff's offices. Now that you know what we do, let me get to the story. I used to work the late shift before switching to days. This story happened while I was working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I remember driving around the city in my patrol vehicle, listening to our 2-way radio for any calls, when I got one in my district. It was a burglary alarm on the north side of the city, out in the desert. It must have been around 1 in the morning when I was sent to check it out. As soon as I pulled onto the street leading to the property, I rolled in dark, which means I shut off all the lights. The building used to be an onion packaging factory with hangars on the west side of the property, but now it was abandoned, and we were contracted to watch it. I've been in there alone many times when I checked it twice a night, but I never had an experience until this night. Keep in mind that the property does not have working lights at all. I pulled onto the west side of the property, visually inspecting the exterior perimeter when I observed a slightly open door. I keyed up on my radio Lincoln 1 to control, dispatch. Go ahead, this is Lincoln 1. Be advised I have an open door on the west side of the hangars. Can you roll an additional unit to my location and stand by my vehicle? I smoked a cigarette under the drizzle that is rare for Southern California. I liked the rain, though the wind was also blowing pretty hard that night, from what I remember. About 5 minutes later, my partner arrived, who also happens to be my good friend outside of work. We pulled our guns and flashlights and went inside. The first thing you always notice when entering is the stench of onions. It was so pungent that you could taste it through your nose. The hangars we were clearing were huge, dark, empty, and filled with that rotten smell. This is where things got creepy. We could hear the light drizzle hit the sheet metal and the wind blowing through whatever cracks it found. Then it happened. We heard footsteps on the roof of the hangars. I looked at my partner and said, "What the heck? These hangars don't have access to the roof. How did they get up there?" He replied, "I don't know, call it in Lincoln 1 to control. Be advised we hear footsteps on the roof. We are code 6, 10 to 23 until further." Which pretty much means we're out on investigation and to stand by until further notice. Dispatch acknowledged, and we walked through the building, checking all corners until we got outside. We checked the perimeter of the building, and just like I thought, there was no access to the roof. Plus, it was raining. Who the heck would be up there anyway? We put it off as the wind. We checked everything possible and called it Code 4, meaning the area was clear. However, to this day, my partner and I still talk about it. Huffing and gasping for air, I arrived at work and told my coworker what had just happened. He didn't look surprised, but rather concerned. He told me that another coworker had seen the same creature recently and had described it exactly as I had, down to the last detail. Needless to say, I am never walking to work in the dark again. From now on, I'll just call an Uber. As a security officer in Southern California, I work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities we service. My job as a patrol officer is essentially the same as that of a police officer. We respond to calls ranging from simple trespassers to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and shots fired. I've been in a few foot and vehicle pursuits. That's just how we operate, which is why we work with the local sheriff's offices. One night, while working the late shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I received a burglary alarm call in my district. It was around 1 a.m. when I was sent to check it out. The location was an old onion packaging factory, now abandoned, out in the desert on the north side of the city. As I pulled onto the street leading to the property, I turned off all the lights on my patrol vehicle. The factory had no working lights, and the stench of onions was overwhelming. As I inspected the exterior perimeter, I noticed a slightly open door. I radioed for backup and waited under the light drizzle. My partner arrived about 5 minutes later. We drew our guns and flashlights and entered the hangar. The building was huge, dark, and filled with the pungent smell of rotten onions. As we walked through the hangar, we heard footsteps on the roof. We were baffled because there was no access to the roof, and it was raining. We reported the situation to dispatch and continued our investigation. After checking everything, we concluded that the noise was probably just the wind. Nonetheless, the experience was unnerving, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. As I made my way to the break room, huffing and gasping for air, I told my coworker what had just happened. He didn't look so much surprised as he did concerned and informed me that another coworker had seen the same creature recently. He described it exactly as I had, every last detail. Needless to say, I'm never going to walk to work in the dark again. From now on, I'll just call an Uber. I'm a security officer for a company in Southern California. We work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities that we service. As a patrol officer, my job is essentially the same as that of a police officer. Unlike your typical observe and report security guards, we respond to calls ranging from simple trespassers to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and shots fired. Hence the officer in the title. I've been in a couple of foot and vehicle pursuits. That's just the way we operate, which is why we work alongside the local sheriff's offices. Now that you know what we do, let me get to the story. I used to work the late beat before being switched to days. When this story happened, I was working from 2200 to 0600 in the morning. I remember driving around the city in my patrol vehicle, listening to our two-way radio for any calls when I got one in my district. It was a burglary alarm on the north side of the city, out in the desert. It had to be around 1 in the morning when I was sent to check it out. As soon as I pulled into the street leading to the property, I rolled in dark, which just means I shut off all the lights. The building used to be an onion packaging factory with hangars on the west side of the property, but now it was abandoned, and we were contracted to watch it. I had been in there alone many times, checking it twice a night, but never had an experience until this night. Keep in mind that the property does not have working lights at all. Anyway, I pulled onto the west side of the property, visually inspecting the exterior perimeter when I observed a slightly open door. I keyed up on my radio Lincoln 1 to control dispatch. Go ahead. This is Lincoln 1. Be advised, I have an open door on the west side of the hangars. Can you roll an additional unit to my location? I stood by my vehicle, smoking a cigarette under the drizzle, which is rare for Southern California. I liked the rain though. The wind was also blowing pretty hard that night from what I remember. About 5 minutes later, my partner arrived, who also happens to be my really good friend outside of work. We pulled our guns and flashlights and went inside. The first thing you always notice when entering is the stench of onion. I mean, it was so pungent that you could taste it through your nose. The hangars we were clearing are huge, dark, empty, and filled with that rotten smell. This is where things get creepy. We could hear the light drizzle hit the sheet metal, the wind blowing through whatever cracks they found, and then it happened. We heard footsteps on the roof of the hangars. I looked at my partner and said, "What the heck? These hangars don't have access to the roof." "How did they get up there?" He replied, "I don't know. Call it in." Lincoln 1 to control. Be advised, we hear footsteps on the roof. We are code 610 to 23 until further notice, which pretty much means we're out on investigation. Stand by until further notice. Dispatch acknowledged, and we walked through the building, checking all corners until we got outside. We checked the perimeter of the building, and just like I thought, there was no access to the roof. Plus, it was raining. Who the heck would be up there anyway? We put it off on the wind. We checked everything possible and called it Code 4, which means no further action needed. We left the property, but that night stuck with me. It wasn't the first time I had experienced something unexplainable on the job, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the spring of 2017, I worked at the Melting Pot restaurant in Littleton, Colorado. The restaurant occupies an old 3-story building that was built in the early 1900s as a Carnegie library. There have been many documented cases of paranormal activity at this location, and it was even featured on a ghost hunting TV show. The most haunted area is located in the basement in a little L-shaped cove that has 5 booth tables for dining. The cove was down 2 little stairs, and immediately upon entering, you had a 4-top table on your left and a 2-person table on your right. Past the 4-top in the corner was a large round booth, and around the bend were 2 more 4-top tables and a dead end. The last table in the cove was considered the most haunted table in the restaurant. Many times, people would bring spirit contacting boards and other conjuring tools to try and evoke a spirit, often sitting at the last table to do just that. One day, a co-worker and I were cleaning these tables late one night. He suddenly exclaimed, "Ow, did you just scratch me?" I hadn't touched him and told him as much. He lifted up his shirt, and there were 3 large bleeding scratches running down his back. He immediately freaked out and soon after quit, feeling as if this entity was trying to follow him home. A year later, I hadn't seen anything else unusual, One night around midnight, I started antagonizing the spirit in this area. Despite seeing that kid get scratched, I still wasn't convinced. I was down there yelling out, "You don't exist. If you did, you would show yourself." I figured there wouldn't be an answer, so I went back to bussing my last tables for the night. I was carrying a bus tub down the back stairs and had to walk by this cove to get to the kitchen. I've been a server for years and never drop anything, let alone something out of a bus tub. Well, I go walking by the cove, and a metal fondue pot goes flying out of my bus tub, down the 2 stairs, and into the haunted cove. I continued to the kitchen to place down my bus tub, then grabbed a towel to clean up the chocolate mess I'd made. At that point, I'd forgotten about the antagonizing I'd done an hour earlier. So I go charging into the L-shaped cove to clean up the chocolate fondue pot that had somehow just leapt out of my bus tub and down the stairs. As soon as I entered, something grabbed me by my right shirt sleeve, throwing me into the rock wall and immediately smashing my head into it. It left me with a goose egg bump and a large cut on my forehead. I was so startled and bleeding everywhere that I had to run to the bathroom to tend to my wounds. Back when I was a senior in high school, I had a weekend job pumping gas at a highway gas station in New Jersey. I saw all kinds of crazy stuff in the year or so that I worked there, but honestly, most of the stuff just comes across as funny nowadays. Even some of the closer calls with crazy customers or the time I got robbed didn't seem life-threatening. I knew how to handle myself and understood not to do anything but cooperate with someone desperate enough to stick a gun in my face. We were trained to give up the money since it was insured, but there's no way to put my brains back in my skull if I decided to be a hero over $50 and change. The guy who robbed me was even more scared than I was, so now it's just a crazy but not so scary story that I have no problem telling at parties or on dates. However, there's this one thing that happened that I don't bring up so easily, and it only comes out when people ask about the worst thing I saw. Sometimes I'm not even in the mood to talk about it because it might have been a rare one-time thing that only happened to me. But other times I feel like I need to warn people so they can recognize and act on it like I did. This story isn't about making myself out to be a hero, I promise you. I don't feel that way at all. I feel like I did the bare minimum. One night I was working the night shift when an Audi with South Carolina license plates pulled in around 2 in the morning. A guy got out asking me to fill up his car while he went to the bathroom. He put a $20 bill into my shirt pocket, promising another $20 if I could fill the tank quickly. Naturally, I rushed to do as he said, and I noticed a middle school-aged girl asleep in the back seat, covered up to her chin with a blanket. I didn't want to wake her and risk losing my tip, so I proceeded to fill the tank as fast as I could while keeping an eye on her to ensure she wasn't waking up. She remained asleep, but as I focused more on filling the tank, I suddenly got a chill. When I looked back up at her, she was staring at me with her eyes wide open. Before I could say anything, she mouthed 2 clear words through the glass, "Help me." There was a moment where I just stopped dead, my hand on the gas pump no longer filling up, and then I heard the guy's voice asking, "Hey, everything all right over there?" I had to think quickly. I told him that something was wrong with the pump, and that I needed to head back inside to reset it so the gas would start pumping again. I went on about how it had been happening on and off all day, apologized for the inconvenience, and assured him it would be working in just a second. I ran inside, pushed the silent alarm, and then walked back out to finish filling up his tank. He fell for the whole thing, and if I say so myself, I put on an Emmy-winning performance of not completely freaking out, strangling him, or making some misguided attempt to actually rescue the girl. The cops later told me that I did the right thing. I had his plate number on the cameras, got a good look at him and the girl, and his fingerprints were on the cash he gave me. I made sure to call 911 as soon as they left, but thanks to the silent alarm, a patrol unit was already on the way. The dispatcher redirected the cop to the road the guy pulled onto, and bingo, he was pulled over on a traffic stop. Supposedly, all ended well for that particular girl, but how many others don't get a chance to signal for help like that? How many end up in the trunk instead of the back seat? How many don't get rescued? It's those kinds of questions that I try not to think about, which is why I don't like telling the story too much. However, I feel it's important to share it sometimes as a warning. If this reaches as many people as possible, maybe it'll save me a whole lot of breath and a whole lot of sleepless nights. I grew up in the forests of Northern California, where stories of Bigfoot and other cryptids were as common as tales of regular wildlife. My father was a park ranger, and I often accompanied him on patrols. One summer evening when I was around 13, we were out on one of these patrols. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the forest was alive with the sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves. As we walked along a narrow trail, my father suddenly stopped and put a finger to his lips, signaling for me to be quiet. He pointed to a spot about 50 yards ahead, where the trail curved out of sight. I strained my ears and heard a low, guttural growl. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, deep and resonant, almost like a combination of a bear and a large cat. We moved slowly and cautiously toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As we rounded the bend, we saw it. Standing in the middle of the trail was a creature that defied explanation. It was about 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed a menacing red in the fading light. It looked like a classic Bigfoot, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. My father whispered to me to stay back, but I could see the fear in his eyes, a fear I had never seen before. He reached for his radio to call for backup, but before he could even press the button, the creature let out a deafening roar and charged at us. My father pushed me behind him and pulled out his service revolver, firing a warning shot into the air. The creature stopped in its tracks, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. We stood there, shaken and bewildered, trying to process what had just happened. My father radioed in the incident, and within an hour, several other rangers arrived to search the area. They found large, deep footprints and some tufts of fur snagged on branches, but no sign of the creature. That night, back at the ranger station, my father and the other rangers debated what we had seen. Some thought it was a bear with mange, others a misidentified moose. But my father and I knew better. We had seen something that defied explanation, something that didn't fit into any known category of animal. It was a creature from the realm of folklore and nightmares, a living, breathing cryptid. Over the years, I've thought about that encounter countless times, trying to make sense of it. I've read every book and article I could find on Bigfoot and other cryptids, hoping to find answers. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. Was it really a Bigfoot? Or was it something else entirely, something that defies categorization? To this day, I can't say for sure what we saw that evening in the forest, but one thing is certain: it was a moment that changed my life forever, a moment that opened my eyes to the mysteries that still exist in our world. And every time I hear a strange noise in the woods or see an unexplained shadow, I remember that creature and the fear in my father's eyes. It serves as a reminder that there are still things out there that we don't understand, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered, former hospice nurse here who spent the better part of 3 years working night shifts, so I have a couple of horrible ones to share with you. The first involves massive pulmonary bleeding. This guy had a tumor in his lungs, and it kept growing until it basically popped an artery. I had just put the guy to bed and had been out of the room for no more than 5 minutes when I heard his wife scream after something wet-sounding hit the floor. I ran back into the sight of so much blood pouring out of this guy's mouth. I sent his wife out of the room under the pretense of cleaning it up, but I knew that he only had a few minutes left. I grabbed his hand and told him everything would be over soon. He tried to speak, but nothing but a few weak gurgles came out. It's horrible to see someone so afraid, especially when there's nothing you can do for them. He was begging me to help him breathe again, but unless someone is on the operating table, there's just nothing you can do for them except comfort them as they pass. He went into shock after a minute or two, then eventually died 10 minutes later. I remember how the floor around him was this deep, sticky red from all the congealed blood, and how it took 2 hot washes to get all the stains out of my uniform. I've seen similar in a patient who suffered a sudden rupture of extreme esophageal varices. For people who don't know what that is, you have blood vessels in and around and throughout your esophagus, as is the case for most of the body. In patients with liver disease or liver failure, the liver's inability to do liver stuff caused a huge amount of pressure to build up. This increased pressure in the liver's blood supply causes the back of the blood to be pushed into vessels connected to the liver, and these inflamed blood vessels are called esophageal varices. Think hemorrhoids of the gullet. They can vary in severity, and most often they are undetectable until an ultrasound confirms or if bleeding happens. There are medications that calm the vessel somewhat, but it's a chronic problem that can't be reversed, and it only worsens. To put it as plainly as possible, you have these ticking time bombs throughout your whole upper body, and sooner or later, one of them is going to explode. I had another patient, a 32-year-old alcoholic, who was going through chronic organ failure and just couldn't seem to fight his way out. He had tried rehab before and had been a candidate for a liver transplant at one point, but there's a threshold. If a person is so sick that they die regardless of a transplant, a doctor isn't going to waste the surgery. So in essence, the guy drank himself out of transplant candidacy and into an early grave. He was admitted to the hospital because he needed a tap to drain the liters of fluid that build up in his abdomen due to the liver failure, but the buildup of toxins was also causing heart failure and severe respiratory problems. During this hospitalization, he made the decision to go DNR or DNI at 32 years old, which means do not resuscitate. We thought that that was going to be the end of him, but miraculously he made a kind of recovery and worked his way up to being able to waddle around the ward. He was discharged, promising to clean himself up, but was admitted to the emergency department a few weeks later with uncontrollable vomiting. He'd fallen off the wagon, gone on a binge, and it straight up killed him. Shortly after arriving on our units, and despite giving him a bunch of anti-nausea medications, his vomit went from bile appearing to straight blood. I've never seen so much blood coming from a person and in such a violent, painful, messy way. We tried to replace all the blood that he was losing in the hopes that the varices would stop bleeding, but they didn't. Although we worked our butts off trying to keep him alive, he began to lose consciousness and his breathing slowed. An irregular heartbeat quickly turned into prolonged ventricular tachycardia, which is when the lower chambers of the heart beat very fast in quick succession, which is obviously something you don't want. Normally we'd be considering defibrillation by that point, but because he'd opted for a DNR, we just had to step back and let it happen. His heart rhythm quickly deteriorated further into a slow, very abnormal rate and rhythm, and then started to fail completely. The little blips on the monitor were rare at this point, and his breathing had gone from gasping a few times each minute to nothing at all. I've been in situations like that where staff are devastated to have failed to save someone's life. Sometimes it seems like someone's about to pull through, and then they're just gone, and the doctor is calling it. But that time was the first time when, instead of the sense of loss and frustration that everyone just has to swallow so they can carry on, there was a sense of relief, this almost indescribable sense of relief throughout the room, because he was no longer suffering anymore. To this day, what happened in that room remains the most harrowing example of what addiction can do, and the outcome was the most hideously miserable but preventable death I've ever witnessed. I worked as a correctional officer for 2 years, 3 months, and 18 days. 2 years, 3 months, and 18 days were all I had in me. After that, $1 million wouldn't get me through the doors of that county jail, and $1 billion would only have me working weekends. My jail wasn't even all that hardcore. There were plenty of other jails up and down California that had way worse reputations than we did. But still, working those night shifts could be like a horror movie sometimes. Inmates loved throwing their own urine and feces at us and other inmates. Lots of inmates got jiggy with each other and sometimes with staff too. Basically, all the crazy stuff you see on TV is either based on reality or very representative of the kind of stuff inmates get up to. Even so, there's only so long before some of the more common stuff becomes totally routine and only the really wilder stuff sticks out. The first thing that comes to mind is when I found an inmate trying to set fire to her clothes with a lighter she'd smuggled in her, you know what. I have no idea why she was trying to burn herself like that, but she cried when I caught her. Not because she was thankful that I stopped her or anything, but because I told her that I'd have to take her lighter away. I told her to throw it under the door, and she did, and then I left her to crying. Then there's the girl I found half dead because she hung herself with a bedsheet. I was so convinced that she was gone, but another correctional officer rushed in to give her CPR, and she woke up coughing and spitting and then went on and survived. It was just about the craziest thing I'd ever seen. I swear she was almost blue, and then the next minute she was sitting up, drinking water, and thanking us for getting her down. You'd think that she'd be angry that we stopped her, but I guess people just get trapped in the moment, and when they realize what they almost threw away, they're grateful that you helped stop it. Another time, a girl claimed she was having a heart attack, but none of us believed her since she had pulled a very similar trick by pretending to be sick and then attacking us or trying to escape. But then after the shift changed, a newer male correctional officer was on the girl's wing and suddenly started doubting that she was faking. The idiot opened up her cell door, kneeled down next to her, and before he could do anything, she grabbed him by the collar, pulled him down, and sank her teeth into the skin of his cheek. By the time the CERT team got there, our new correctional officer had a chunk missing from his face, and I heard the biter took a hell of a beating before she gave in. She got aggravated assault by a prisoner charges. The male correctional officer needed 12 staples, and he never came back. Then there was this other inmate, a much more aggressive and heavy-set girl, who decided she wanted to die. She tried jumping off the second story, but a nearby correctional officer saw her doing it and grabbed her. Instead of trying to shove the correctional officer off before jumping, the heavy girl decided she was going to take the correctional officer with her. They were both teetering over the railing before another male guard showed up to pull them both back over, but I heard for a few seconds there it looked like both the correctional officer and the inmate were headed to the hospital that night. That inmate was always trouble. I think because she knew how physically dominating she was. The only issue was some girls just don't care how big their opponent is. One girl told me they make coffins her size too.